It's a pleasure to host Mr. Daniel Fried, a Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow, Atlantic Council, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, who will talk to us about the global geopolitical overview. Is the world changing? Mr. Fried, good to have you with us. Can you hear me?
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
We are honored too. So, under your capacity with your expertise as an Atlantic, of course, Council Fellow, but as a former ambassador to Poland, could you tell us a few things about your views regarding the latest development, the geopolitical development? Is the world actually changing?
Well, easy. Of course the world is changing. It's always changing. The question is how. Putin and Xi think they know how the world is changing. They think, and they say, that the time of democracy is over and the time of the dictator has arrived. They believe that their system is better, and they are acting on this belief. They also believe that instead of a rules-based order, the world should be divided into spheres of domination. China should have its, Russia should have its sphere of domination. Putin is putting this into practice. He launched a war against Ukraine as a war of imperial domination and national destruction. So the great authoritarian powers in the world believe the world is changing, and they believe their time has come. We've seen this movie before. Greece has seen this movie before. In the mid-20th century, dictators in Italy and Germany and a militarist regime in Japan believed that the time of democracy was over and the time of the authoritarian had come, and they launched wars to advance that theory on the ground in reality. What about ourselves? What about the democracies? Well, we are challenged both from without and from within. And part of that is the result of our own mistakes, many of them. In my country, in Europe, we have all made mistakes that have given rise to a lack of confidence in our system, to economic stresses, and among some, a belief, as in the 1930s, that in fact democracy was in trouble. So that's the bad news. The good news is that democracies are generally and habitually underrated and their resilience disregarded. And dictatorships think too much of themselves, and sometimes we think too much of them. Let's take Ukraine. Remember that the cause of the original cause of this conflict was Ukrainians' desire to draw closer to the European Union. The issue was signing a modest agreement between Ukraine and the EU, an association agreement that Vladimir Putin forbade them to conclude. That was the original cause. The Ukrainians believe in democracy. They believe in Europe. They believe in our values, sometimes more than we do. They believe that Europe and joining Europe is a civilizational choice, and it's one they want to make. And they are fighting for their country and their lives in a combination of national patriotism, but in democratic form. They believe in themselves, and apparently we believe in them and in ourselves sufficiently to help them, to help the Ukrainians resist Russia's aggression. I don't know the way the war will end, but I do know that Putin is not winning, and that the Ukrainians are fighting back in their name and in ours, and in the name of our common values. So you ask the way the world is changing. It is not merely in Ukraine where a democracy is fighting back against forces of oppression and aggression. In Iran, we see that people are rebelling against the tyranny of the regime and the morality police. And in China, For the first time since 1989, there are widespread protests. Also, in the name of individual liberty, I would not count out democracies. I know that democracies have their problems. God knows my own country does as well. Our own failings in the United States have brought us to the point where there is a constituency for Donald Trump, former president, who has argued that the US Constitution must be terminated. Terminated, his words. So this is not a case of an American, myself, pointing fingers at anybody else. We all need to look in the mirror at our own countries and our own failings and understand why it is that so many people have doubts about our own system. But we should also remember that people have faith in our principles and in our best practices when they act accordingly. Now, I think the Biden administration understands everything I've said. I think that it is an administration rooted in a belief that democracy is worth defending and a belief that the world will be in a better order if the democracies work together. This is, I fear, as a former diplomat, easier said than done. Issues of trade, issues of support for Ukraine, how to approach China, how to support the people of Iran, how to handle global challenges like climate change. These are not going to give way to formulas or grand principles, but the larger principles can guide us as we go forward. So you ask the way the world is changing. I would say it is changing because we are in the latest phase of a long struggle between democracy and tyranny. And although it is sometimes oversaid, yes, it is appropriate to talk about the universal value of democracy in Greece that gave us the whole idea in the first place. I'm honored, as I said, I'm honored to be invited to speak. And I gather there are questions coming and I welcome them. And I welcome the opportunity to speak with you. I only regret that I couldn't be there in person. Believe me, I regret it more than you know.
Thank you very much. Well, believe it, it's like you're here, actually. You're speaking about democracy. However, we all are witnessing a rising populism in countries, democratic countries, actually, including even, U.S., okay? What is the reason behind this? I mean, we have to really identify what is the actual reason and why we are facing, such populism and such polarization, actually. What's your opinion on that? Is a crisis, a financial crisis? Is the growing gap between, the upper class and the middle class? What it is at the end?
I want to speak about my own country. I think we all face similar versions of the same thing. America's not unique. We all have our populist movements, sort of right-wing populism, sometimes on the left, but now on the right. I think the causes, at least in my country, are years, decades of stagnant standards of living for many people while the rich become super rich. Income disparities in the United States are as great as they have been since the era of the Titanic, right? Steerage versus first class. And I say this with no particular pleasure. The great advance of American prosperity also coincided with a swelling of the relative prosperity of the middle class and a rising standard of living for the working class. And this has been stagnant. So this is one major problem. A second problem is that we have none of us has figured out a key to national patriotism in a time of rising ethnic diversity. America is a country not founded on race or blood, but founded on principles. And yet even we seem unable to move forward to complete that vision of a nation based on a creed, on a belief in human equality. In Europe, the situation, I suppose, is somewhat different. Europe is composed of nation states, but ethnic purity, well, never really existed. You know, what are the English except the English except a combination of a whole lot of nationalities brought together by time and circumstance? We need to find definitions of patriotism and civic engagement that can capture our hearts as well as our minds, and link that to policies which will provide broad-based prosperity. And I think that many of us understand this, that the question now, as in the 1930s, is how to make the model of liberal democracy, of regulated capitalism, work in practice. We succeeded in the 1930s, challenged, and after the 1940s, challenged by Nazism and communism. We succeeded. And we can do so again if we remember how we succeeded in the first place, by both having faith in ourselves and our values, but also the ability to put these values into practice in practical ways. That's a long answer, but you asked a serious question, so I gave it my best.
Thank you. Let's move to another topic. Speaking about democratic countries, okay, what are your views about the transatlantic relations in light of the recent geopolitical developments, but also in light of the Inflation Reduction Act that has raised quite dust here in Europe?
It sure has. And you notice that during their press conference, where Macron was clearly pushing on this very point, President Biden acknowledged that there were some problems and some clumsiness. What did he say? Tweaks need to be made, which for a president of the United States under those circumstances is a way of, what he was saying was, yeah, I get it. I hear you. Look, you're right to raise that issue. And the Biden administration clearly indicated that instead of digging in and throwing rocks and complaining, we will try to work through this. And I'm glad. This is good. Some of the European complaints, I must say, sound a little odd. There are some in Europe complaining about the U.S. selling LNG to Europe. Well, I remember when Europe complained that we weren't selling enough LNG to Europe. But you asked another part of the question, which is, what is the transatlantic relation? What is the state of the transatlantic relationship? Look, we need each other. Okay, we need each other. The Biden administration is the most pro-European US administration since maybe that of George H.W. Bush. The great centers of democracy, Europe, the United States, and other countries, the other G7, need to work together. And that means we need to think of ourselves as friends. And I prefer the US administration talk about friend shoring, that is not US shoring, friend shoring of production, to nationalist-minded economic policies. Putting that into practice is a problem, but we need to do it. The world is changing and the democracies need to stand together, because if we don't stand together, we're toast.
Well, Mr. Fried, thank you very much for being with us. We really appreciate being part of our Greek Economic Summit. We're looking forward to see you in person, hopefully next year or in another event of our chamber. Thank you again, and have a good day.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It sounds like a great conference.
Thank you. Appreciate it.